You'll bury that baby before spring, Anya, my neighbor sneered, tightening her shawl. No one survives the Siberian winter with a child that small. Those words cut through me sharper than the cold wind outside our cabin. I remember standing by the doorway, rocking Yuri in my arms, his tiny fingers curling around the edge of my sleeve. He was only 6 months old, my whole heart wrapped in linen. His breath was soft, white against my chest. But her words, those cruel, ordinary words, stayed longer than any blizzard. My name is Anya Sokolova. I am 26 years old, wife to a railway worker, and once, long ago, I thought life would be kind. Before Siberia. Before the exile of the soul that comes when the snow never stops falling. We lived on the edge of a rail camp near Kansk Ridge, where the new iron lines were cutting through mountains like scars. The men worked from dawn till night, hammering through rock while the wind howled like wolves. The rest of us, wives, widows, and children, waited. We cooked, we washed, and we prayed the ground wouldn't swallow them. Our cabin was barely more than wood and frost. I lined the cracks with rags and whispers of hope. Some nights the snow crept through anyway, dusting Yuri's cradle like sugar. I would wake with my heart racing, afraid he'd grown cold in his sleep. I'd press him to my chest, breathe warmth into his tiny hands, and tell him stories about St. Petersburg, where his father once promised we would go when the railway was finished. Mikhail, my husband, was strong, stubborn, and silent. He smelled of coal, iron, and dreams he didn't dare speak aloud. Sometimes he brought home bread, sometimes only silence. But every night, before sleeping, he would brush the snow off his coat and kiss Yuri's forehead. He'll have a better life, he'd whisper. A city life. I wanted to believe him. Truly I did. Then one afternoon, as I washed clothes by the frozen stream, I noticed a shadow watching me from the tree line. A large husky, its coat mottled with gray and white, eyes the color of storm clouds. He didn't growl or run. He just watched, chest rising slow, ears high. There was something solemn in him, as if he knew things about this land that no man could. When I dropped a piece of bread by accident, he darted forward, snatched it, and disappeared into the woods. But that night, when the wind began to roar again, I saw him sitting near our cabin door, guarding the darkness. Mikhail called him Baran, after the fiercest winter wind. From then on, he never left the edge of our yard. The others called him Bad Luck. Stray dogs carry death, they warned. But Yuri would giggle each time the dog's shadow passed the window, his laughter bouncing off the walls like bells in the frost. I chose to see it as a blessing. The nights grew longer. Snow piled high against the roof. The air tasted of iron and smoke. And sometimes, when the silence was too heavy, I swore I could hear the mountain breathing. Low, steady, ancient. That evening, just before the storm, I stepped outside to hang the last of Mikhail's shirts. The horizon glowed pink and gray, beautiful and cruel. Boran stood still, his fur stiff with frost, staring toward the ridge as if something deep beneath the earth had stirred. Then, a sound, so faint I almost missed it. A rumble, distant and rolling, like thunder trapped beneath the snow. I pulled Yuri close to my chest. Somewhere far up in the white silence, the mountain whispered back. And I swear, I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. My name is Anya Sokolova. They say Siberia humbles every soul that crosses its border. For me, it broke me first, and then taught me what strength really means. My name is Anya Sokolova, born in St. Petersburg, 1881, in a room filled with lace and laughter. My mother was a seamstress. My father drove a horse carriage for a wealthy family near Nevsky Prospect. We were poor, yes, but there was music in our house and warmth in every meal. Back then, I believed the world rewarded good hearts. Then I met Mikhail. He came to Petersburg with coal-stained hands and dreams as big as the Tsar's railways. He was 23, proud and shy in the same breath. He'd come to fix pipes in the factory where I worked, and within months, he'd captured my heart with a quiet promise. One day, I'll build you a house strong enough to keep the snow outside. But when work turned scarce and debts piled high, he took a contract with the Imperial Railway Company, a posting to Siberia. The pay was good, the danger worse, and the distance eternal. I followed him anyway, thinking love could warm anything. It couldn't. Siberia was not land. It was punishment wearing the face of beauty. The air glittered with ice, The wind sliced like knives. Days bled into nights without color. Yet amidst that endless white, life persisted. Children's laughter echoing through camps, women boiling snow for tea, and men carving steel through frozen soil. When Yuri was born, I felt hope again. He came early, during a snowstorm that lasted 3 days. The midwife said he was small but stubborn, just like his father. I wrapped him in a shawl woven by my mother back home, the only piece of Petersburg I had left. Sometimes, I'd step outside and hold him up to the gray sky, whispering, "You'll see blue someday, my little one. Real blue. Not this frozen sky." But the others in the camp didn't share my hope. They'd shake their heads when they saw me walking with Yuri strapped to my chest. "He won't last the winter," they'd murmur. "No baby does, not out here." I tried not to listen, but words can freeze deeper than ice. The only creature who seemed to believe in us was Baran, the stray husky who'd appeared like a ghost one afternoon. Mikhail didn't trust him at first, but the dog kept his distance, never begging, never barking, just watching. One night, Mikhail came home late, his beard crusted with frost, his hands trembling from exhaustion. I offered him soup, but he waved it away and sat by the fire. Baran crept closer from the door, tail low. The two stared at each other for a long moment, man and beast, both survivors of something too vast to name. Then Mikhail did something I'll never forget. He broke a piece of his bread and tossed it toward the dog. "If you want to stay," he said quietly, "you earn it by guarding them." Baran took the bread, lowered his head, and curled up beside our door. From that night on, he was family. Sometimes, when I sang Yuri to sleep, I'd hear the faint sound of his paws crunching through the snow outside, tracing circles around the cabin. Other times, I'd catch his reflection in the frosted window, those storm-gray eyes fixed on the mountains. It gave me comfort, thinking something wild was watching over us. But deep down, I knew the mountain didn't like to be watched. The wind had changed. The snow had grown heavy. Even the crows had left their perches. And Baran, he no longer slept. He just stood in the cold, staring toward the ridge. That night, before dawn, he began to growl. Kansk Ridge wasn't a place people lived. It was a place they endured. It sat like a scar across the white spine of Siberia, where the Trans-Siberian tracks curved between mountains that groaned under their own weight. The company called it progress. We, the ones who froze, called it the edge of the world. Each morning before dawn, a whistle would pierce the cold, and the men, bundled in coats stiff with frost, would march toward the tunnels with pickaxes over their shoulders. Their boots crunched like breaking bones. By the time the sun reached the ridge, the camp was already swallowed in smoke and noise. Hammers clanging, rails ringing, the hiss of steam against the frozen air. I'd stand by the doorway with Yuri strapped to my chest, watching Mikhail join the line of gray silhouettes. He'd look back once, raise his gloved hand, and disappear into the snow. Every day the same. Every night, I'd wait for that hand to return. Inside the camp, life followed rules carved by cold. We boiled snow for water, stretched black bread until it became memory, and prayed the blizzards would show mercy. The walls of the cookhouse were lined with icicles so sharp you could shave a man with them. Even laughter froze in the air before it could reach your ears. But we made our small joys. When the men came back at dusk, someone would always light a lantern outside the mess hall, and its glow looked like hope itself, a golden promise flickering in the dark. The wives would gather near it, trading stories, pretending not to count the ones who hadn't returned. That winter, there were many who didn't. The mountain had been restless for weeks. Engineers said the snowpack was heavy but stable. They always said that, until the ground swallowed their words. One afternoon, while hanging sheets by the fire, I overheard two foremen whispering by the supply shed. "The upper ridge cracked again last night. Ignore it. We're behind schedule. The Tsar doesn't pay for fear." Their arrogance frightened me more than the mountain itself. That night, when I stepped outside, the silence was unnatural. No wind, no birds, not even the creak of wood. The kind of silence that listens back. Buran stood near the rail tracks, his fur dusted with snow, eyes locked on the ridge. He wasn't just watching, he was waiting. I walked toward him, shivering. "What is it, boy?" I whispered. He turned his head slightly, ears flat, tail stiff. Then he released a low, throaty growl, not at me, but at the mountain itself. A shiver ran through my spine. Even the stars looked dimmer. When Mikhail returned from his shift, I told him. He laughed it off. The dog senses wolves, that's all. The ridge is fine. Don't let the cold make you see ghosts. But I saw something else in his eyes. Worry, buried deep under bravado. Later that night, he couldn't sleep. He paced the cabin, rubbing his hands together, muttering about the cracks in the tunnel walls. When I reached for him, he took my hand and pressed it to his chest. If anything happens, take the baby and run downhill. Promise me. I didn't answer. There was nowhere to run in Siberia. When he finally slept, I stayed awake, rocking Yuri and watching the lantern flicker. Buran lay outside, half buried in snow, eyes still open. At some point before dawn, a sound drifted through the air. I remember that morning so faint it might have been a sigh. The way the world came from the ridge, moments before the mountain was breathing again. The sky was white, the kind of white that feels endless, like the heavens forgot to close their doors. Frost glittered on every surface. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Mikhail had already gone to the ridge with the early team. I watched his figure fade into the fog until he became nothing more than a moving shadow among the snow. Yuri was asleep in his cradle, his tiny mouth open, cheeks pink against the cold. I tucked the blanket tighter around him and went to fetch firewood. The door creaked like an old bone. Outside, Buran stood facing the mountain again, his body rigid, tail low. Go rest, old friend, I whispered, patting his head. But his fur bristled under my hand, and his ears twitched toward the ridge. That's when I heard it, the faintest crack, like distant ice splitting on a frozen river. I turned, scanning the slope. The ridge stood silent. Only a plume of powder drifted down from the upper peak. It looked harmless, almost beautiful. Then came the second sound. Louder, deeper. It wasn't ice, it was the earth groaning. I dropped the firewood. Somewhere above, snow shifted in massive sheets. I could feel it in my feet, the tremor, the vibration, the warning. Buran barked once, sharp and commanding, and then he ran toward the cabin, circling me, pushing me with his body as if to drive me inside. Buran, stop, I shouted, but he kept barking, louder now, desperate. The wind changed. A roar began to rise from the ridge, low and rolling, gathering strength like a beast waking from sleep. Birds burst from the trees in black flocks. The horizon turned gray. I froze. For one terrifying moment, I saw it. An entire wall of snow tearing free from the mountain, sliding downward with unstoppable force. It wasn't falling. It was charging, devouring everything in its path. Yuri, I ran inside, heart hammering, snatched him from the cradle, wrapped him in my shawl, and threw myself against the far wall. The air outside screamed. Buran hurled himself through the doorway after me just as the first blast of wind hit. The windows shattered. The door flew off its hinges. And then, darkness. The world became sound and pressure. The walls cracked. The roof groaned. Snow poured in from every gap, heavy as stone. I tried to breathe, but the air had turned to ice. I clutched Yuri to my chest, curling my body around him, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in years. For a moment, I thought I heard Mikhail's voice shouting my name from somewhere outside, but it was drowned instantly by the roar of the avalanche. Then silence. I was buried in it. When I opened my eyes, everything was black and weightless. I couldn't tell up from down. The air was thin, sharp. My hands shook as I felt for Yuri, still warm, still breathing. I pressed my lips to his forehead. Mama's here, my love. Mama's here. Somewhere above the snow, faint and far away, a dog began to howl. It was Buran. That single cry sliced through the suffocating dark, raw and relentless. It was the sound of life refusing to surrender. And in that frozen tomb, I held my baby close and whispered, "Find us, Buran. Please find us." When the mountain fell, it didn't roar like thunder, it screamed. A sound so deep it felt alive, clawing through the earth, crushing everything it touched. And then it was over. A silence so heavy it pressed against my ribs. I didn't know if I was dead or dreaming. I tried to move, but the weight above me was unbearable. Every breath scraped my throat like broken glass. My fingers trembled as I groped through the dark until they found what mattered most, Yuri. His tiny chest still rose and fell beneath the shawl. His warmth was faint, fragile, but there. For a long time, I just listened, to his breathing, to my heart pounding, to the strange, suffocating stillness that followed the avalanche. Somewhere close, wood creaked under pressure. The smell of pine and dirt filled my lungs. I realized I wasn't in open air anymore. The cabin had been swallowed whole. I shifted my body slightly, testing the weight around me. Snow poured into my lap like sand. The candle by the stove was gone. All light was gone. My voice cracked. "Mikhail, can you hear me?" No answer. I shouted louder, and my own voice came back to me, muffled, small, swallowed by snow. Panic clawed up my throat. I pressed my ear to the icy wall beside me, straining for any sound. Footsteps, digging, something. But there was nothing. Just the soft, rhythmic groan of a world buried alive. The baby stirred. I felt his fingers twitch against my arm. That little movement cut through my fear. If he was still alive, I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. I tore at the snow above me, but it was like clawing through iron. My nails split. My arms ached. The cold bit deeper. I screamed until my throat bled, but no one answered. That was when I heard it, a faint scratching sound from somewhere above. Slow, steady, persistent. At first, I thought it was part of my imagination, some echo in my dying mind. But then I heard it again, a rhythm, like paws against packed ice. "Baran," I whispered. A soft whine echoed through the snow, distant but real. Hope flared in my chest, so suddenly it burned. I pressed my lips to Yuri's head and began to cry, not from fear, but from something deeper. "He's there, Yuri, he's out there." Baran had survived. Outside that frozen grave, I imagined him pacing above the buried roof, his paws bleeding, his fur stiff with frost. He was just a stray, unwanted by anyone. But now he was the only thing standing between us and death. The scratching grew faster. The snow above shifted slightly, tiny flakes falling onto my face. He'd found us. He knew. I whispered through the dark, as if he could hear me. "Good boy, keep going. Don't stop, Baran. Please, don't stop." Hours, or maybe minutes, passed. Time had no meaning anymore. My breath fogged into crystals before my eyes. Yuri whimpered softly, his skin cooling under my touch. I tore another strip from my shawl and wrapped him tighter, pulling him closer to my chest. When exhaustion came, I fought it. I bit my lip until it bled. If I slept, we'd freeze. I forced myself to hum an old lullaby from Petersburg, the one my mother sang when I was small. The sound trembled through the darkness, faint but alive. And somewhere above, the scratching paused. Then a long, mournful howl broke the stillness. It wasn't the sound of despair. It was a promise. Baran was calling for help. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Find someone, bring them here." The air thinned. My vision blurred. I could feel the cold crawling up my spine. My last thought before sleep took me was of his eyes, the color of storm clouds, and how they'd never once looked away from the ridge. If faith had a sound,
When I woke,
it was a dog's howl cutting through snow. The world around me was black, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I couldn't tell how long I'd been unconscious. Minutes, hours, maybe an entire night. But the air was thinner now, colder, heavier. Every time I inhaled, it scraped my throat like frost on glass. I shifted slightly, feeling the ache in my ribs where a beam must have fallen. My fingers were stiff, my legs numb from the cold. And then, beneath all that pain, I felt movement. Yuri. He stirred weakly against my chest, a tiny sigh escaping his lips. His warmth was faint, fading. I pressed his body tighter to mine, rubbing his arms through the shawl, whispering, "Stay with me, my love. Stay with Mama." But the silence was monstrous. It wasn't just quiet, it listened. Every sound I made, every heartbeat, seemed to echo back from the snow-packed walls. It felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to surrender. Somewhere above, I thought I heard a low groan. The snow shifted slightly, releasing a trickle of ice crystals that fell onto my face. Hope flickered, but it was gone just as quickly. Maybe it was only the mountain settling, pressing down harder. I closed my eyes and tried to remember light. The sun over the Neva River. The glittering canals of Petersburg in spring. My mother's laughter, my father's calloused hands. But memory felt far away, like a dream I wasn't sure I'd ever lived. The cold began whispering cruel things. "No one is coming, Anya. He's too small to survive. Go to sleep." I bit down on my tongue to drown it out. Blood filled my mouth, warm, metallic, real. It reminded me I was still alive. I leaned close to Yuri's ear and began to hum again. The same lullaby, voice trembling through the dark. Sleep, my darling, sleep in snow. The moon will guard, the wind will know. It wasn't for him, it was for me. A prayer disguised as a song. Then I heard something. Faint, rhythmic, scratching. I froze, straining my ears. Yes, there it was again. Soft, distant, persistent. A sound breaking through the endless dark. Baran, I whispered. My voice cracked, barely audible. For a few seconds, nothing. Then, a muffled thump. And another. The air trembled. Snow dust trickled from above, and I felt something shift in the weight around us. Tears welled in my eyes. You found us, I breathed. Good boy, you found us. The scratching grew faster now, frantic, desperate. He was digging, fighting the mountain itself. I could almost picture him, his paws torn, his breath steaming in the cold, refusing to give up. Keep going, I whispered. I'm here. I wanted to call louder, to scream, but my throat wouldn't obey. My lungs burned. So I did the only thing about dogs like him. I began to tap gently on the wooden beam beside me. Born when God pitted the message. If that's true, then Baran was no ordinary dog. Over and over. He was a storm the way Mikhail used to signal me when the avalanche swallowed at camp. Most of the men ran downhill. The air was filled with screams, wind, and flying ice. Then, nothing. When the snow settled, it looked like peace had returned. But under that white stillness were bodies, and cries too faint for human ears. Baran dug. He dug until his paws bled, until the snow turned pink beneath him. He didn't understand death, but he understood absence. The woman who fed him bread, the small one who laughed when he wagged his tail, they were gone. And in his heart, the wind howled their names. The men called out from the distance, searching, but not near enough. They shouted to one another, their voices carried away by the cold. One man, a foreman, tried to pull Baran away. Get, beast, he barked, swinging his stick. But Baran snapped his teeth at the air, refusing to move. He stood his ground on the mound of snow where the cabin had once stood. His ears twitched, nose pressed to the surface, searching for something only instinct could explain. When the stick struck him, he didn't retaliate. He simply lowered his head and began to dig again. Some of the younger workers hesitated. They had seen the dog before, guarding that little house night after night. Maybe he smells them, one muttered. The foreman scoffed. They're dead. We dig for the living, not ghosts. And yet, Baran would not leave. All day the storm grew worse. The wind tore at his fur, snow crusted over his muzzle, his body trembled with exhaustion. But still he dug. He stopped only to lift his head and howl. A deep, hollow sound that rolled down the valley like grief itself. That howl reached far beyond the ridge. Down in the lower camp, men paused mid-shovel. One of them, Alexei Morozov, a railway engineer, turned toward the echo. He'd heard dogs howl before, but never like that. It wasn't a warning. It was direction. Where's that coming from? He asked. Another man pointed up the slope. Old Camp Road. The one buried last night. Alexei stared at the ridge. That's where Sokolov's cabin was. He remembered Mikhail, a quiet man with steady eyes. And the woman, Anya, always carrying that baby bundled in red wool. Without another word, Alexei grabbed his lantern and started up the ridge. Baran didn't notice the men at first. He'd been digging for hours, the rhythm of his paws slowing. When the light of the lantern flickered across the snow, he lifted his head, eyes wide, tail stiff. He barked once, hoarse, desperate, then resumed digging, faster than before. The men reached him, panting. What's he doing? One asked. Alexei knelt beside the dog, pressing a gloved hand against the mound. The snow was strangely warm beneath the surface, a pocket of trapped air. He leaned closer and heard it, a sound too soft for most ears. A muffled hum, and a baby's faint cry. His eyes widened. They're alive. The others froze. Baran barked again, scratching at the spot. Give me shovels, Alexei shouted. No one moved for a heartbeat, stunned. Then they rushed to obey. The dog didn't wait for help. He pressed his body low, digging furiously, snow spraying behind him like white fire. His breath came in short bursts, steam rising from his muzzle. When the first shovel hit the frozen roof beam, Baran stopped and looked up, tail wagging once. He backed away just enough for the men to dig beside him. Each strike of metal echoed like thunder in the stillness. Keep digging, Alexei said. She's under here. I can hear her. The others worked in silence, the dog pacing around them like a guardian, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the hole forming beneath their hands. Above them, the blizzard raged on. But below, buried in the heart of the mountain, a woman stirred, hearing the sound of metal and movement. Somewhere between life and death, I heard them. The scrape of shovels, the bark of a dog, the faint hum of hope. And I remember whispering into the darkness, voice breaking through cracked lips. "Good boy, Baran, don't stop now." When I came to, it was because of a sound, soft, rhythmic, scraping above me. At first, I thought it was the wind. But no, this sound had intent. It had rhythm, desperation. It was alive. Yuri whimpered against my chest. I could feel the chill creeping deeper into his body, the faint tremors fading. I pressed my lips to his forehead. His skin was cold as marble. "Stay with me, my darling. Don't you dare leave me." My voice was so weak I barely recognized it. Each word came out as mist. I listened again, scrape, scrape, and then the faintest metallic clang. It was different from before. Sharper, heavier. Not just paws. Not just the faithful scratching of my dog. It was shovels. The realization hit me like a spark in the dark. Someone was up there. Someone had found us. I wanted to shout, but the air was razor thin. I could only whisper, "Here. Please, here." No reply. Only the steady rhythm above me. Still, it was enough. Hope, thin as a hair, stretched through the darkness. But the snow was relentless. Every breath felt shorter than the last. I tore the edge of my sleeve and wrapped it around Yuri's head, trying to seal in whatever heat was left. His tiny lips were pale, his breath shallow, his little body limp. I rubbed his chest, desperate. "Wake up, baby. You have to breathe." When he didn't stir, panic clawed through me. I pressed his face to my skin, letting my warmth spill into him, whispering stories from the world above. About sunlight, about birds, about how his father used to hum while fixing the broken stove. And then, through my trembling, I began to hum again, the same lullaby. But this time it wasn't a lullaby. It was a signal, a sound, a message, something that said, "I'm still alive." The rhythm of the digging changed. Faster now, urgent. And between those strikes, I heard it. A familiar bark, rough and broken but defiant. "Baran." I couldn't stop crying. "You beautiful creature," I whispered. "You didn't leave." The snow above began to move. I could hear voices now, muffled shouts, a man yelling orders. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Command, urgency, life. "Here." I tried again, though it came out as a breath, barely sound at all. "We're here." The roof above cracked. A beam groaned. I clutched Yuri tighter as snow rained down on my shoulders. For a heartbeat, I thought the whole thing would collapse. But then light. The faintest orange glow pierced through the dark, thin as a candle flame. It cut through the layers of white, like dawn breaking through endless night. I blinked, blinded, gasping. I could see shadows moving. Figures. And the shape of a dog thrusting his head through the hole. Snow spraying everywhere, his muzzle covered in frost and blood. "Baran," I sobbed. He barked once, hoarse, joyful. His eyes locked on mine. And then his paw reached down toward me, pressing against my arm as if to say, "I found you." A voice followed, deep, human, commanding. "Hold on down there. We've got you." The roof split open wider. Lantern light poured in. Hands reached through the snow, strong and trembling. I could barely move, but I managed to push Yuri upward. "Take him," I cried. "Please, take my son." A man grabbed him, wrapping him in his coat, shouting for blankets. Then another hand reached for me. "We've got you, ma'am. Just hold on." I wanted to answer, but my body gave way. Everything went soft, weightless. The last thing I felt was Buran's warm breath against my cheek. His heartbeat steady, powerful. The sound of snow shifting, shovels clanging, men shouting, light breaking through the dark. And above it all, a dog's cry piercing the storm like a prayer answered. When I woke again, everything was light. Blinding, burning light. White as heaven, cold as judgment. For a moment, I thought I was dead. Then I felt pain. The kind that reminds you life hasn't let go yet. My chest ached, my lips cracked, my hands numb beyond feeling. But when I turned my head, I saw movement, a shadow beside me, pacing slowly. It was Baran. He was alive. His fur was matted with blood and ice. One ear torn, eyes half closed from exhaustion. Yet he stood guard beside me, as still and watchful as a soldier. When he saw my eyes flutter open, he whimpered softly and pressed his nose against my cheek. "You found us," I whispered. My voice was barely there. He gave a short, broken bark and curled beside me, his warmth seeping through the blankets they'd thrown over us. I turned my head and saw Yuri, wrapped tightly in thick furs, a faint blush of life returning to his face. His tiny hand twitched. A sound escaped my lips, half sob, half laugh. I reached toward him, but my body wouldn't obey. "Easy now," a voice said gently. "You're safe." I blinked and focused. A man crouched beside me, his face rough with frost and soot, his eyes kind but weary. "I'm Alexei Morozov," he said, "engineer with the railway." We heard the dog. I tried to speak, to thank him, but the words tangled in my throat. "You've been buried for almost 2 days," he continued, shaking his head in disbelief. "We were searching the lower ridge. Would have missed you completely if not for him." He glanced at Buran, who lay with his head resting on my shoulder, eyes half shut from exhaustion. "That dog saved you." He wouldn't move from the spot. I couldn't stop crying. Not loud sobs, just silent tears that froze before they reached my chin. The rescue team had set up a small camp near the Avalanche site. The air reeked of smoke and wet wool. Around us, men moved through the snow like ghosts, digging, shouting, searching for others. Every so often, a shovel would strike something, and the camp would go quiet. Then the silence would break again with orders and grief. I wanted to ask about Mikhail, but I didn't dare. Hope was a fragile thing, and I wasn't ready to watch it die. When they carried Yuri to the fire to warm him, I forced myself to sit up. My limbs screamed in protest, but I needed to see him. Needed proof that he was still part of this world. As they unwrapped the shawl around his face, he let out a small, weak cry, the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. The men nearby smiled, some even crossing themselves. In a place where death was daily, a baby's cry was a kind of miracle. Alexei knelt beside me again. "We're moving what's left of the survivors to the lower camp," he said. "There's a medic waiting there. Can you walk?" I shook my head. He nodded once, then looked at Buran. "He's strong. He'll help pull." They made a sled from a broken door and wrapped furs around me and Yuri. Buran was harnessed at the front beside 2 smaller dogs. His breath came out in clouds, his legs trembling, but when Alexei gave the command, Buran lunged forward without hesitation. The sled groaned across the snow, cutting tracks through the whiteness. The cold bit deep, but the sight of the dog's broad shoulders pushing through the storm filled me with something no warmth could give, faith. I watched his tail sway with every step, slow and steady, as if even the mountain itself couldn't break him. Behind us, the ridge loomed, silent now, stripped of its fury. And as we descended, I realized that everything the avalanche had taken, this dog had given back. Life, light, and the proof that miracles don't always fall from heaven. Sometimes, they dig their way up through snow. The blizzard had quieted, but the world still looked broken. White hills stretched endlessly around us, grave markers made of snow. The wind no longer screamed. It whispered now, as though mourning the lives buried beneath it. Our small rescue party moved slowly through the valley. The sled creaked. The men trudged ahead in silence, their faces hidden behind frostbitten scarves. Every few minutes, someone would stop and listen, hoping for a voice under the snow, fearing they might actually hear one. Buran led the way, his body stiff with exhaustion, yet his steps never faltered. He didn't walk like an animal anymore. He moved like a purpose. Each time he glanced back at me, our eyes met through the cold air. It was strange, but in those glances, I felt something divine, like the mountain had chosen him to be the line between life and death. Beside me, Yuri stirred. I lifted him carefully, letting his cheek rest against my heart. His tiny breath brushed my skin, warm, fragile, alive. The sound made every ache in my body worth it. Alexei walked beside the sled, his lantern swaying like a golden heartbeat in the storm's dim light. "We'll reach the lower camp soon," he said, his voice rough but reassuring. "Hold on a little longer." I nodded, though I could barely feel my lips. As we moved down the slope, the air changed. It grew heavier, thicker, colder. The snow beneath the runners began to crackle, and the faint sound of rushing water echoed below. "Careful," one of the men shouted. "Ice shelf ahead." They steered the sled toward firmer ground, but I looked down and saw through the fractured surface, dark water moving beneath transparent glass. It was beautiful and terrible all at once, like seeing death asleep under your feet. And then, I heard something. At first, I thought it was the echo of our own movement. But no, this sound came from below, deep beneath the ice. A rhythm, a pounding, almost like voices. I leaned forward, straining to hear. It came again, a faint, distant hum. Men shouting, metal against rock, but muffled, distorted, as though the ice itself was trying to speak. I called out to Alexei, "Do you hear that?" He stopped walking and tilted his head. The others followed suit. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a faint cry drifted up from the ground. "God," one man whispered. "There are more down there." The team sprang into action, dropping to their knees, pressing their ears against the ice. The cries were faint, fading in and out, but unmistakable. People were trapped beneath another section of the avalanche, alive and running out of air. Alexei cursed under his breath, waving the others forward. "Mark this spot. We'll come back after we get her to the camp." "No," I said, surprising even myself. My voice came out cracked but firm. "You can't leave them. Not now." He hesitated. "If we stop, you and the child will die anyway if they don't," I interrupted. The men looked at me, then at the dog. Boran had stopped walking, his head turned toward the sound beneath the ice, tail low, ears sharp. He whimpered softly, just once, and began to scratch at the surface. It was enough to decide them. They tied the sled to a pine stump and began digging where the sound was loudest. Boran stayed beside them, pawing the snow, barking each time the noise below grew faint. The rhythm of rescue began again, shovels striking, men shouting, ice shattering. The air filled with urgency and faith. Minutes, or hours, passed before a hole broke open and a hand shot through the snow. Then another. 2 men were pulled out, frozen, barely conscious, but alive. Their lips blue, their eyes dazed. The older one fell to his knees and whispered, "We heard a dog. Thought it was a ghost." I smiled weakly through tears. "No ghost," I murmured. "Just a guardian." Boran barked once, tail thumping weakly. His legs trembled, his breath shallow, but his eyes still burned with the same fierce light. When the men carried the survivors toward us, I reached out and touched the dog's head. "You've saved more souls than any priest," I whispered. He closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against my palm. And in that frozen wasteland, surrounded by death and silence, there was something holy in the sound of our breathing. A woman, a child, a handful of men, and a dog who refused to leave the living behind. By the time we reached the lower ridge, the wind had risen again. Not as violent as before, but colder, sharper, like the mountain had found a new way to test us. The rescue camp was a cluster of tents glowing faintly through the blizzard, their canvas walls fluttering like ghosts. Smoke curled from the chimneys, carrying the smell of wet wool, burning pine, and something bitter, grief, maybe. They led me and Yuri inside the largest tent. The sudden warmth made me dizzy. My skin stung as the frost melted, pain blooming back into feeling. I didn't realize how close I'd been to losing my fingers until I saw the color return to them, pale pink from white. Yuri slept soundly in a pile of blankets, his breathing steadier now. I stared at him for a long time, afraid that if I blinked, he might vanish like a dream. Outside, I could hear voices, arguing. One of the men, loud, impatient, was saying, "It's madness. We've already lost 2 crews. You dig again up there, and the mountain will bury you next." Alexei's voice cut through, low and sharp. "They're alive. That's not madness, it's duty. The dog doesn't count as proof," the other spat. "You're trusting an animal over instruments and maps." The tent flap opened, and the argument came inside with the cold. A tall man entered, his beard thick with ice, his eyes bloodshot. He looked at me, then at the child, then back to Alexei. "So this is her? The woman the beast found?" Alexei nodded. The man's jaw tightened. "Miracle or not, we can't risk more men because a stray scratches at snow." I wanted to speak, but my throat burned. My words came out hoarse. "That dog saved my son. He saved me. He heard what your machines couldn't." The man's expression didn't change. Luck, he muttered. Nothing more. Boran, who'd been lying quietly near the door, lifted his head. His fur was still wet, his paws raw, but when the stranger's tone hardened, the dog's ears flattened and a low growl rumbled in his chest. The man froze, startled. Alexei stepped between them. Enough, he said. You weren't there. You didn't see how he dug, how he refused to stop. Without him, we'd have been burying bodies, not saving them. The older man scowled, but he backed down, muttering something under his breath as he stormed out. When the tent flap fell closed, Alexei turned to me. You rest. I'll take the next team up. We'll keep digging where the snow's thinnest. Take him, I said, nodding toward Boran. He'll know where. He hesitated. He's exhausted. If we push him too far, he won't stop, I whispered. He never does. Alexei studied the dog, then me, and finally nodded. All right. We move at first light. That night, I didn't sleep. The tent creaked in the wind, and the snow outside hissed like whispers from another world. I lay awake, watching Yuri's tiny chest rise and fall, listening for Boran's breathing beside us. He dreamed fitfully, paws twitching, whimpering softly in his sleep. I reached out and stroked his head. His fur was coarse and cold, but beneath it I could feel the heartbeat of something ancient, something that refused to yield. Good boy, I murmured. You keep finding the living. When dawn broke, pale and gray, the men gathered again, shovels slung across their shoulders. Boran stood with them, swaying slightly but alert. His eyes had the same fierce focus they always did, the look of something that knew. The man who had doubted him sneered. If your miracle mutt leads us wrong, you'll answer for it. Alexei ignored him and gave the signal. The group moved out into the storm, disappearing into the white distance. From inside the tent, I watched them go, clutching Yuri close. The snow swallowed them whole within minutes. I whispered a prayer, not to saints, not to God, but to the only guardian that had not failed me. Guide them, Boran. Don't let them die for their doubt. And though the wind was howling again, I could have sworn I heard one clear bark in reply, echoing down the mountain. Not angry, not afraid. Just steady. A promise, carried through the cold. The wind was cruel that morning, the kind that stung your face like glass. From the tent doorway, I watched them climb, tiny figures swallowed by the white. Their shapes blurred until they became shadows against the mountain. Boran led the line, a gray silhouette darting ahead, pausing, then running again. Even from this distance, I could feel his urgency. Yuri slept against my chest, warm beneath the blankets. Every so often he'd make a little sound, a whimper or a sigh, and I'd press my hand against his back, reminding myself he was still here, still breathing. But my mind was up there, with them, with him. I prayed silently, not words I'd learned in church, but something raw and formless. I prayed that the mountain would show mercy, that Boran's heart would hold. Hours passed. The sky grew darker, thick with snow that refused to fall. Men came and went from the camp, their faces drawn, their voices low. Each time I heard the crunch of boots outside the tent, I sat up straight, hoping for news. Each time, it wasn't them. Then, sometime past noon, the sound changed. Far off, barely audible through the wind, I heard a faint echo. A bark. I froze. Then another bark, followed by shouts, human voices, urgent and wild. I rushed out of the tent, clutching Yuri, ignoring the cold that bit through my clothes. Down the slope, men were pointing toward the ridge, where figures were emerging through the fog. Alexei's team. They were running. I stumbled forward, snow clawing at my legs. A medic grabbed my arm, but I shook him off. What happened? They found them, he said breathlessly. There are people alive up there. Alive. The word hit me like fire. When the men reached the camp, they were drenched in ice and sweat, faces gray, eyes wide with disbelief. Alexei was the last to arrive. He fell to his knees beside the fire, gasping for air. His hands were bleeding, his beard caked with frost. 4 of them, he panted. 4 alive, under 7 feet of snow. How? Someone asked. He looked up, eyes shining with something close to awe. The dog. He wouldn't move until we dug. He stood over one spot and kept howling until my ears rang. Then, he stopped, shaking his head. Then I heard it. A knock. Faint, but there. 1 tap, pause, then 2. My breath caught. That rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, tap. I'd done that, down in the dark, when I'd thought I was alone. He found them, I whispered. He remembered. Alexei nodded slowly, as if he'd heard my thoughts. First shovel hit wood, then a voice. A woman, weak but alive. The camp erupted in noise. Cheers, cries, the crackle of renewed fires. Men who'd given up on faith now spoke of miracles. They looked at Buran differently now, not as a stray, but as something sacred. He stood apart from them, snow clinging to his fur, head low, breath coming in slow clouds. His paws bled through the ice, but he didn't seem to feel it. When Alexei approached, he lifted his gaze, those storm-gray eyes calm and distant. I went to him, dropping to my knees. You did it again, I whispered, stroking his muzzle. You saved them. He leaned into my touch, closing his eyes. For a moment, I could hear nothing but our breathing. Then a low rumble echoed through the valley, faint but unmistakable. The mountain shifting again. Alexei turned sharply toward the ridge. We have to move them out now. Men scattered to pack supplies, shouting orders over the wind. Buran looked up at the ridge, ears twitching. A small whine escaped him, as if he could already sense what was coming. The others might have doubted before, but no one doubted now. When Buran turned his head toward the mountain and barked once, the men followed without question. They trusted him more than their maps. And for the first time in my life, so did I. They say salvation doesn't arrive in thunder or fire. It comes quietly, like dawn sneaking through a crack. For me, it came as a flicker of orange light through the snow. The rescue team had gone back up the ridge after the mountain's last groan. The storm had eased, but the air still trembled with danger. I waited below with Yuri in my arms, watching the gray blur of men disappear into white again. Every second stretched into eternity. The sky grew darker, and then, faintly, through the silence, a sound reached us. A shout, then another, and then, cheering. I clutched Yuri tighter and ran toward the slope until the medics held me back. Stay down, they warned, but my heart was no longer listening. Through the swirling snow, I saw lanterns moving in a line, weaving down the mountain. At first I thought it was the men returning. Then I saw one of the lights dip, stop, and flash wildly. A signal. They've broken through, a voice called. They found them. The men at the base erupted into motion, stretchers, blankets, rope. The sound of life racing toward life. When Alexei came down first, his face was ghost pale but radiant, eyes blazing with disbelief. He was shouting over the wind, his voice breaking. We reached them. 2 women and a boy, still breathing. He stumbled past me, leading others back up, but as he passed, I saw blood on his gloves. He didn't even notice. His eyes were fixed uphill, toward where miracles were happening. And then, through the flickering lantern glow, I saw him. Buran. He was covered in snow, a phantom made of ice and willpower. His paws were red, his fur clumped, his chest heaving, but his tail wagged faintly as he trudged beside the rescuers. The men shouted his name as if it were a prayer. When he reached me, he stopped. His legs buckled, and he dropped into the snow. For a heartbeat, I thought he'd fallen for good. I dropped beside him, brushing the frost from his face. His eyes opened slowly, meeting mine. You did it, I whispered. You brought them back. He blinked once, tired, but proud. The next moments came in fragments. The kind memory never arranges neatly. The crack of axes breaking through the last layer of ice. The collective gasp when a hand reached up from the hole. The sobs, the laughter, the chaos of men shouting instructions, lifting bodies, wrapping them in wool. And above it all, the sight I'll never forget. Light pouring into darkness. The hole they dug was deep, wide enough for 1 man at a time. When the rescuers lifted the survivors through it, the lanterns shone on their faces, pale, frostbitten, yet alive. Eyes blinking against the light they thought they'd never see again. One of the women clutched a small cross to her chest. Her lips moved soundlessly, but I could read them. Spasibo. Thank you. When the last survivor was pulled free, the men collapsed beside the opening, some laughing, some weeping openly. Even the skeptics, the ones who had mocked the idea of following a stray dog, stood in stunned silence. Alexei turned to them, voice hoarse. Tell me again about your machines. Did they find them? Or did he? He pointed at Buran. The men had no answer. One of them knelt beside the dog and bowed his head. I was wrong, he said quietly. Forgive me, old friend. Buran didn't move. He just lifted his head slightly, eyes half closed, wind brushing through his fur. In that moment, under the bruised sky of Siberia, every man there believed in something greater than science, greater than survival. They believed in him. I pressed my forehead to Buran's. Rest now, I whispered. You've done enough for 10 lifetimes. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes, the faintest sound escaping him, a sigh that sounded almost like relief. And as lanterns swayed and snow fell around us, the hole in the earth glowed like a wound made holy. A hole of light, where death had retreated the last survivor from the snow. Faith with the sky had turned the color of steel, had taken its place. The air itself felt brittle, charged with something unseen. Every man in the camp knew what that meant. The mountain wasn't finished. The first snowflake hit my cheek like a warning. Then came another, and another. Within minutes, the wind rose, fierce and sharp, swirling through the valley like a living thing. Another storm, someone shouted. We have to move now. The rescuers scrambled into motion, shouting orders, gathering ropes and stretchers. Lanterns flickered in the wind, casting frantic shadows across the snow. The survivors, half-conscious, trembling, were wrapped in furs and tied to sleds. Alexei ran past me, shouting over the roar. We have to get everyone to the military post by nightfall, or we'll be buried again. I clutched Yuri close, his small body pressed to my chest. He whimpered softly, his little hands gripping my sleeve. I could feel the storm breathing against the back of my neck, closer every second. And then I saw Buran. He was standing near the edge of the ridge, staring into the wind. His fur whipped around him, snow gathering on his muzzle, but he didn't flinch. His body swayed slightly from exhaustion, yet his eyes, those gray, eternal eyes, were still alive with purpose. Alexei noticed him too. He can lead the sleds, he said to his men. He knows the terrain better than any of us. One of the others hesitated. He's half dead already. He won't make it. Alexei looked at him, jaw set. He's made it further than any man here. They tied Buran to the front sled. When he felt the harness tighten around his chest, he gave one low bark, as if to say he understood. I climbed onto the second sled, Yuri tucked under layers of fur and wool. The rescuers formed a line behind us, pulling, pushing, fighting the snow that already reached their knees. Go! Alexei shouted. Buran lunged forward. The sleds jerked into motion, gliding down the ridge. Snow whipped around us like smoke. The world narrowed into flashes of white and gray, the sound of the wind and the rasp of runners over ice. I couldn't see the path. I couldn't see the men behind us. All I could see was the shadow of the dog ahead of me. Head down, shoulders straining, muscles trembling with each pull. He was guiding us through chaos. At one point, the ground beneath us cracked, a hollow sound like thunder. The lead sled swerved as the ice gave way. One of the men screamed. For a heartbeat, I thought we were all going under. But Buran veered sharply left, dragging the line with him, the sleds jerking violently, but staying upright. He'd smelled the weak ice before any of us saw it. The wind howled louder. My face burned with cold. My hands were stiff, locked around Yuri. I tried to keep my eyes open, to focus on the movement of Buran's tail swaying ahead. It was hypnotic. Left, right, like the rhythm of a heartbeat pulling us toward survival. Every few minutes, Alexei would shout something, directions, encouragement, but the storm swallowed most of his words. All I could hear clearly was Buran's breath, the heavy panting of a creature who refused to surrender. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time dissolved in the white. When my strength began to fade, I pressed my face against Yuri's head and whispered, "You'll live, my love. You'll live because he believes you will." At last, through the blur of snow, I saw it. A faint orange glow far ahead. Lanterns. The military post. Alexei's voice rose over the wind. There. He's found it. Hold on. The final descent was chaos. Men shouting, sleds bouncing, ropes snapping, but Buran never slowed. He dragged until his legs buckled, until his paws left streaks of blood in the snow. When we reached the gates, soldiers rushed out, shouting orders, pulling us into shelter. The moment the sled stopped, I fell to my knees, clutching Yuri. And Buran, he simply collapsed. The men gathered around him. He lay still, chest heaving, ice clinging to his fur like shards of glass. His eyes were half closed, But when I crawled toward him, he turned his head weakly, pressing his muzzle to my hand. "Good boy," I whispered through my tears. "We're safe now." Outside, the storm screamed and tore at the world, but inside that small post, there was warmth. And the sound of a single heartbeat that refused to stop. The storm howled all night, battering the walls of the post until they creaked like old ships at sea. Every gust felt like the mountain trying to reclaim what we'd taken. Its silence, its dead, its vengeance. Inside, the soldiers worked in silence, tending to the rescued, melting snow for water, wrapping frostbitten limbs in strips of cloth. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and kerosene. Lanterns swung on their hooks, shadows dancing along the walls like restless ghosts. I sat near the stove with Yuri wrapped against my chest. He was warm again, his tiny breath steady, his cheeks flushed from life. I ran my hand over his hair, still amazed he was here, still real. But my eyes kept drifting to the corner of the room. To Buran. He lay stretched on an old coat, his fur stiff with ice and dirt, his paws bandaged clumsily by one of the soldiers. His chest rose and fell shallowly, each breath sounding like a struggle. Alexei sat nearby, cleaning his tools, but every so often he'd look up at the dog and shake his head in quiet disbelief. "He shouldn't still be alive," he murmured. "No creature could take that much and keep breathing." "He's no creature," I whispered. "He's willpower and flesh." Alexei smiled faintly. "Then we owe willpower a medal." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small tin cup of broth, sliding it toward Buran. The dog's nose twitched. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head and lapped once, twice, then stopped, his strength spent. I moved closer, kneeling beside him. His eyes found mine, dim but still aware. When I touched his head, he made a low sound deep in his throat, a soft rumble that felt like gratitude. "You can rest now," I told him. "You've done enough." But I could tell he didn't believe in rest any more than I did. His body trembled, but his eyes kept shifting toward the door, toward the wind that screamed beyond it. The mountain still called him. At dawn, the soldiers decided to move the survivors to the main garrison 3 miles east. The storm had calmed just enough to make travel possible, but the path was treacherous. Ice drifts, hidden cracks, and the constant threat of collapse. Alexei argued to wait another day. "We push them now, we'll lose people," he said. But the commander shook his head. "If we wait, the river will freeze over." We moved. They prepared the sleds again. I held Yuri tight, wrapping him in every blanket I could find. My limbs felt like stone, but I forced myself to my feet. Then, behind me, I heard claws on wood. Buran was standing. His legs trembled under his weight, but his gaze was steady. He limped toward the door, pushing past the soldiers who tried to hold him back. "Leave him," I said softly. "He's going." Alexei sighed. "He'll die out there. Then he'll die leading." The men exchanged glances. One of them finally nodded and unhooked the lead harness from the wall. "All right, old boy," he said, voice low, "one more time." They hitched Buran to the front sled again. He didn't resist, didn't hesitate. When the ropes tightened, he braced himself, looking back once, as if counting the lives behind him, and then faced the white expanse ahead. The march was brutal. Wind whipped across the plains, snow stinging our faces like shards of glass. The sled runners scraped over frozen ground. Every breath hurt. Every step was a prayer. But through it all, Buran led. His back bowed, his paws bleeding through the bandages, his breath visible in short, ragged bursts. Whenever we slowed, he barked once, urging the line forward. Whenever a man stumbled, he'd turn his head as if checking we were still there. Once, the rope snagged on a buried branch, jerking the sled sideways. I cried out, clutching Yuri, certain we'd overturn. But Buran dug his paws into the ice and pulled hard, straightening the sled before it tipped. He didn't look back for praise. He just kept moving. Hour after hour, we followed him. Through wind, through white, through fear. Until, at last, a faint orange glow appeared on the horizon. "The main garrison," someone shouted. "We're almost there." But Buran didn't respond. His legs buckled once, twice, then steadied. He dragged himself forward another 10 yards. Then he fell. The sled slowed to a stop. The men rushed forward. I knelt beside him, tears freezing on my cheeks. "No," I whispered, "not yet. Just a little further." He lifted his head weakly, pressing his nose against Yuri's blanket. His tail thumped once against the snow, then stilled. Alexei knelt beside us, removing his cap. "He made it," he said quietly. "He got us here." The gates ahead opened. Soldiers ran out to meet us, their lanterns blazing. I looked down at Buran, snow beginning to cover his fur, and whispered, "You brought the light again, my friend." And for a moment, I swore I saw it. A flicker in his eyes, faint but certain. As if he knew. As if he'd been waiting only to see us garrison half dead and wholly silent. Men stumbled from the sleds, their limbs stiff from frost. Women were carried inside like broken statues. The soldiers shouted orders, their voices echoing off the wooden walls, trying to make order out of disaster. But I heard none of it. All I could hear was my heartbeat. Heavy, uneven, and the hollow silence that followed it. They tried to take Yuri from my arms, but I wouldn't let go. He was warm, barely, and I needed to feel that warmth to believe we had truly made it. It wasn't until Alexei put his hand on my shoulder that I realized I was still kneeling in the snow. "Come inside," he said softly. "You're safe now." Safe. The word didn't feel real. Not when the storm still screamed just beyond the walls. Not when the one who had carried us through it lay motionless at my feet. Buran hadn't moved since we crossed the gate. His body was half buried in snow, breath invisible in the bitter air. The soldiers had stepped around him, some removing their caps, others bowing their heads without knowing why. I looked down at him, and my throat closed. He looked as though he was sleeping, peaceful, still. But I knew that stillness too well. I had seen it on men after the ridge caved in. Alexei crouched beside me. His gloves were soaked through, his fingers raw, yet his movements were careful, reverent. He brushed the snow from Buran's muzzle and said quietly. He pulled until his heart gave out. My tears fell hot and fast, steaming against my cheeks. Yuri stirred slightly under the blanket, a faint whimper escaping him, and I pressed my face into his hair, trembling. "He saved us," I whispered. "He saved everyone." Alexei nodded. "Then he deserves to be remembered." They carried us inside. The garrison smelled of smoke and medicine. The walls were lined with cots, wounded men lying side by side. Someone pressed a mug of warm broth into my hands. I drank without tasting it. Yuri slept again, safe under layers of wool. His tiny fingers clutched a piece of Buran's fur that had caught on the blanket, a single gray tuft that shimmered in the firelight. Outside, the wind had started to die down. The storm, it seemed, had finally spent itself. Alexei came to me later, his coat still wet from the snow. "We buried him by the northern fence," he said, "facing the mountains." I couldn't speak. My throat burned too much to form words. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and handed me something. A small piece of metal, bent, tarnished. One of the sled buckles, torn from the harness Buran had worn. "He snapped it when he fell," Alexei said. "I thought you'd want it." I took it in my hand. It was cold and heavy, like a relic. I closed my fingers around it until it warmed from my skin. That night, I walked outside when everyone was asleep. The snow had stopped falling, and the stars had returned, bright and sharp as glass. The garrison yard was quiet. Only one lantern flickered by the northern fence, where a small mound of snow marked the spot Alexei had spoken of. I walked toward it, the crunch of my boots the only sound. When I reached the grave, I knelt and brushed away the thin layer of snow that had already gathered. "Thank you," I whispered, "for finding us, for believing when no one else did." The wind stirred gently, lifting my hair, carrying my voice toward the ridge. For a moment, it felt like he was there beside me again, the sound of his breathing, the soft thud of his tail against the ground. I placed my locket in the snow, the one Mikhail had given me on our wedding day. Inside was a tiny sketch of the three of us, me, him, and Yuri. "You saved my son," I said. "That makes you part of us now." The stars flickered above, and the horizon blushed faintly blue, the first hint of dawn after a storm that had lasted too long. Light, faint, trembling, but real. I stood there for a while, holding Yuri close as the sky grew brighter. And when I finally turned to go, I looked back once more at the small mound of snow. "Rest well, brave one. You've earned it." Behind me, the world was waking. The storm had passed. The air was still and clean, the light stretching across the white plains like forgiveness. And though my heart ached with loss, I knew that somewhere, beyond the ridge, beyond the horizon, his spirit was still running, chasing the wind, free at last. When morning came, I woke to the sound of stillness. Not the terrifying silence of the avalanche. No. This was the soft quiet of peace, fragile and sacred, like the world was holding its breath after too much screaming. Yuri stirred beside me, his tiny hand curled against my arm. His skin was warm. For the first time in days, truly warm. I laid my ear near his chest and listened. The small, steady rhythm of his heart filled the air between us, and I wept silently. He was alive. We were both alive. The medic, an older soldier with tired eyes, came to check on us. He smiled faintly when he saw Yuri move. "Strong little fellow," he said. "Born for this land, maybe." I almost laughed. "No one's born for this land," I said softly. "But some survive it." He nodded and moved to the next cot, leaving behind the smell of antiseptic and smoke. I turned my head, and through the open window flap I could see the ridge in the distance. Calm now, wrapped in white stillness, as if all its fury had been spent. The mountain looked peaceful again, but I couldn't forget the way it had sounded when it came alive. That sound would stay inside me forever. Alexei entered, his beard rimed with frost from the morning air. He set a tin of tea by my bed and sat down, resting his hands on his knees. "You slept through most of the night," he said. "I didn't mean to. You earned it." He looked out the window for a long time, then back at me. His expression was softer now, worn by everything we'd lost and everything we'd managed to keep. "They'll send word to Irkutsk," he said. "The authorities will want to know what happened up here. About the avalanche." "About," he trailed off, his gaze flicking toward the horizon. "About him," I finished quietly. He nodded. "There'll be talk. The papers will call it a miracle. But you and I know better." "Yes," I said. "It wasn't a miracle. It was loyalty. It was love." He gave a small smile. "Sometimes that's the same thing." Later that day, when the sun rose higher, I walked outside with Yuri in my arms. The snow glittered like crushed glass, and the air was sharp but kind. Smoke from the garrison chimneys rose straight into the sky. No wind, no threat, only light. A few soldiers stood by the fence where Buran was buried. Someone had marked the spot with a wooden cross, and nailed to it was a strip of metal, his broken harness buckle, polished and shining. I walked over slowly, the snow crunching beneath my boots. One of the soldiers straightened when he saw me. "We thought he deserved a marker," he said. "He deserved much more," I whispered. Yuri stirred, and I held him up toward the sky, just as I had months ago before the avalanche. Only this time, the world didn't seem cruel. The sunlight caught his hair, making it glow like the snow itself. "See that?" I said softly to him. "That's your first sunrise, my love. The one he gave you." The soldier beside me nodded quietly. "You'll tell him about the dog one day?" "Every night," I said, "until he dreams of him." That evening, as the sky turned gold and violet, I sat by the fire writing in a small notebook the garrison commander had given me. My fingers were clumsy, but I needed to capture every detail. The sound of his howls, the warmth of his fur, the light that came when all else had gone dark. When I finished, I looked up through the window. The ridge was glowing faintly under the fading sun. And for a heartbeat, I could have sworn I saw movement there. Just a shadow, darting along the slope, swift and graceful. It vanished in the blink of an eye, but my heart knew what it was. "Run free, my friend," I whispered. "You've done your duty." Yuri sighed in his sleep beside me, his small chest rising and falling. His breathing was strong now, steady, sure. And I realized that in saving him, in saving all of us, Buran had given the mountain back its breath too. The storm was over. The snow was calm. And for the first time since the world fell apart, in Siberia, I let myself breathe slower than the wind, but faster than disbelief. By the end of that week, the story had left the mountains, crossed frozen rivers, and found its way into the hands of men with ink-stained fingers and printing presses in Irkutsk. They called it the Frozen Miracle. I still remember the first time I saw the newspaper. Alexei brought it to me early one morning, his gloves stiff with frost, his eyes carrying a weariness that had nowhere left to rest. He placed the paper on the cot beside me without a word. There, printed in black and white, was our story. The headline read, "Husky saves mother and child buried in avalanche. Railway camp declares it a miracle." Below it was a sketch, someone's hurried attempt to capture Buran. Strong, noble, eyes bright with instinct. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to make my breath catch. I traced the lines of his face with my fingertips, tears spilling freely before I even realized I was crying. He'd hate this, I murmured. Alexei raised an eyebrow. Hate it. He wasn't looking for praise, I said. He just did it. Alexei gave a faint smile. Heroes never believe they are one. Within days, letters began arriving at the garrison. Messages from governors, railway officials, priests, and families of the survivors. They promised medals, donations, ceremonies. Some even wanted to buy Buran, train him, breed him, turn him into a symbol of Russian perseverance. But he was gone. All they could do was honor the space he left behind. The soldiers built a wooden post above his grave, a proper memorial this time, carved with care. At its top they nailed a small brass plate etched with words I will never forget. He found the living when men had given up. Every man who passed that fence removed his hat, even the ones who had doubted him, especially them. As spring began to creep into the valley, the snow melted in slow surrender. Rivers broke free from their cages of ice, and the air smelled faintly of pine and wet soil. One afternoon, Alexei took me and Yuri up the ridge to where the camp had once been. It was almost unrecognizable now, half-buried ruins, broken beams, fragments of what used to be home. This is where he found you, Alexei said quietly, pointing to the hollow where the cabin had stood. Right here. I knelt in the wet snow, touching the ground. It was hard to imagine that beneath my fingers lay the place where life had nearly ended and begun again. Yuri squirmed in my arms, cooing softly. He was stronger now, his cheeks full, his eyes curious. He reached toward the ground, tiny fingers grasping at the snow as if trying to touch the memory itself. He'll never remember any of this, I said. Then you'll remember for him, Alexei replied. That evening, back at the garrison, I heard the sound of bells in the distance. The soldiers said it was the first train to pass through since the Avalanche. The line reopened after months of work. The whistle echoed through the valley like a benediction, low and long, rolling across the snow. It felt like closure. I sat by the window with Yuri asleep against me, the newspaper folded beside us, the brass plate's reflection glinting faintly from where it hung near the stove. Outside, the light lingered longer than usual. The sky blushed gold before fading into indigo. I imagined him, Buran, somewhere beyond the horizon, racing through the fields of eternal snow, chasing the wind he was named after. Maybe that's what miracles truly are, not grand displays of divine power, but small, silent acts that ripple outward, touching lives we'll never see. I looked down at my son's sleeping face and whispered, "You'll grow up knowing his name. You'll know that even in the coldest places, kindness can still burn bright." The fire crackled softly in reply. And in that quiet, I felt it again. The heartbeat of the world returning, steady and alive, as if the mountain itself had forgiven us. Spring in Siberia doesn't arrive like a song. It creeps in slowly, like a secret that doesn't want to be discovered. The snow doesn't melt, it surrenders. And when it does, it leaves behind what the cold couldn't erase: footprints, scars, memories. Weeks passed after the avalanche, and still, the world seemed to speak his name. When the thaw began, the men found paw prints, deep, deliberate tracks leading from the ridge down to the garrison fence, perfectly preserved beneath the crust of ice. Each print filled with water as the snow melted, tiny mirrors catching the sunlight. "Looks like he's still walking home," one soldier said softly. I didn't answer. My throat was too tight. They had offered to move us to Irkutsk, where the railway officials wanted to parade me and Yuri before the press. A display of survival. Proof that the empire could triumph over nature itself. I refused. I couldn't turn what he'd done into performance. Instead, I stayed behind with Alexei and a few of the workers. Together, we built something small but honest, a kennel beside the fence, facing north, overlooking the mountains. Not for him, but for others like him. Within days, stray dogs began to appear. Starved, limping, cautious, creatures driven from the frozen woods by hunger and noise. They came one by one, sniffing the air, circling the mound where he lay, then curling beside it as if recognizing a familiar scent. We fed them scraps, warmed them by the fire, and before long the camp wasn't silent anymore. There were barks and laughter again, the soft chaos of life rebuilding itself. It was Alexei who said it first. Seems the old boy left a patrol behind. Sometimes, when dusk fell and the ridge glowed orange, I'd stand by the fence with Yuri in my arms and tell him stories about the dog who saved him. I told him how Buran had come from the woods with snow in his fur and storm in his heart. How he'd stood between life and death and chose life. How he'd dug through the mountain when even men had given up hope. Yuri would listen quietly, his wide eyes fixed on the fading light. He was too young to understand, but one day, I knew he would. When he began to walk, he'd toddle toward the fence every morning, pointing at the mound of snow that never fully melted there. He'd babble sounds that weren't words, but carried meaning. And one morning, when he was almost 2, he said it clearly, his first real word. Buran. The sound struck through me like sunlight through glass. I fell to my knees beside him, tears burning my cheeks, my heart swelling with something I can only describe as gratitude. Yes, I whispered. That's his name. Years later, when Alexei finally left for the city, he stopped by my cabin before dawn. He carried a worn notebook and a small piece of paper tucked inside. It's from a breeder in Yakutsk, he said. They heard the story. They've named a new sled line after him. They say his blood runs through half their dogs now. I smiled through the ache in my chest. So he lives on. Alexei nodded. In every howl that answers the wind. We stood in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that doesn't hurt anymore, just hums with understanding. When he left, I walked to the fence, the same place where it had all begun. The snow had turned to soft earth. Wildflowers, tiny and blue, had started to grow around the wooden cross. Yuri ran ahead of me, laughing, his boots splashing through puddles. He knelt by the flowers, tracing the letters carved into the plaque with his small hand. He found the living when men had given up. Tell me again, Mama, he said, looking up. The story about the dog who didn't stop. And I did. Because some stories aren't meant to fade. They're meant to be told again and again. Each retelling a heartbeat. Each word a step forward in the snow he once walked. That night, as the sun sank behind the ridge, the wind picked up softly, curling around the cabin like a whisper. I closed my eyes and listened. It wasn't sorrow anymore. It was continuance. A sound that said, I am still here. And I smiled, because somewhere, beyond time and frost, it has been 15 years since that winter swallowed the world. The ridge still stands, calm and vast, its white crown shimmering against the pale sky. But the fear I once felt when I looked at it, that weight that pressed against my heart, is gone now. The mountain no longer feels like a tomb. It feels like a monument. My name is still Anya Sokolova, though few in the village call me by it anymore. To them, I'm the woman from the snow. The one who lived when no one should have. The one whose child was saved by a dog that refused to die quietly. I don't correct them. Titles are only words. The truth lives elsewhere. Yuri is 17 now. Taller than I am, his father's eyes, his own way of listening to silence. When he walks across the yard, the dogs follow him, the descendants of the strays that gathered after the avalanche. He knows each one by name, and they know him by scent and soul. Every spring, when the ice breaks on the river and the valley begins to bloom again, we walk to the northern fence together. The grave is still there, simple and unadorned. The wood has weathered, the lettering faded, but we replace it each year with care. Around it, wildflowers grow in small clusters, blue, white, yellow, pushed up through the same earth that once froze us in. This year, Yuri brought a small carving he'd made from pine. It was a dog, head lifted toward the wind, rough around the edges, but beautiful in its honesty. He placed it at the foot of the cross and said, he should always be looking forward. I smiled. He always did. Sometimes, I think about Mikhail, how he never came back from that ridge. The records say the avalanche took the entire west tunnel. There were no bodies, only emptiness. I like to believe that in some quiet way, Buran carried part of him to us that day. His promise, his strength, his will. I've learned that grief doesn't vanish. It changes shape. It becomes quieter, wiser, more patient. Like the snow itself, it melts, it returns, it reminds. The villagers have built new houses near the rail line now. Children play in the fields where once only silence lived. The sound of the trains in the distance, those deep, steady rumbles, no longer frightens me. They remind me of his howl echoing through the storm, telling the world that life was still beneath the ice. Some nights, when the moon rises full and pale, I sit by the window with a candle burning low. The wind slips through the cracks, soft and cool, carrying the smell of pine and melting snow. And if I listen carefully, I can still hear it. A single, faraway bark rolling down from the ridge. Yuri swears he hears it too. He says it's the voice of spring, the sound that tells the valley it's safe to wake again. Maybe he's right. Maybe Buran never truly left. Maybe he became part of the wind that runs between these mountains, guarding us still. I once asked Alexei, before he moved south, if he believed in miracles. He said, no, but I believe in what makes them happen. At the time, I didn't understand. Now I do. Miracles aren't thunder from heaven or angels with wings. They are hearts that keep beating when they shouldn't. They are paws that dig through despair. They are love that refuses to freeze. As I stand here now, the air warm and alive, the world finally forgiving, I whisper into the wind. You did it, old friend. You gave us the spring. And in the hush that follows, I almost feel it. The brush of fur against my leg. The thump of a tail in the snow. The faint echo of a breath that will never fade. The mountain breathes with me. The valley hums with quiet life. And somewhere, just beyond sight, a gray dog runs through fields of light. Forever chasing the wind he was named for. Buran, the storm that saved us all.